Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the 82nd episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. As always, I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts, and I am thrilled to welcome a very special guest to the podcast today, Patricia Kolesa. She is a fellow registered dietitian and specializes in heart health, and you may not realize that kidney stones and heart health go together, but they do quite a bit. And so we're going to dive into what that connection is and what we can do diet-wise to help both with kidney stones as well as heart health, because there honestly is a whole lot more overlap than not. So welcome, Patricia, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Melanie.
Yes. So before we dive into all the good stuff, what can you just share with the audience a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you help people?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a registered dietitian based here in New Jersey. And funny enough, I'd like to say I'm still a fairly new RD. I've been a dietitian for 4 years, but I like to joke with everybody that I've been through every area imaginable, you name it. I started out in sports nutrition, working with the United States rowing team. And then I went on to do my dietetic internship where I specialized in sports nutrition entrepreneurship.
Oh, cool.
And then from there, I worked in a variety of settings. I jumped in bariatric surgery, weight management, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and then I eventually got into my clinical job. So most recently, I'm actually working on my private practice on the side, Dietitian Dish LLC, which I've been at for a year, and it's been wonderful. A lot of what I like to focus on in my practice is considering nutrition related behaviors and foods you can be adding to your diet, especially because we're so taught so often about what foods we need to restrict or limit, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you know that in the area of kidney stones as well.
Any
Um,
area. It's all about bad foods and bad
exactly.
ingredients. Like, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I guess as somebody who loves food so much, it's so important to me that my clients feel excited and empowered about the changes they're making. So that's really what inspired me to start my business in the first place, given my dietetic related experience over the last couple of years.
Yeah. I love that. And you kind of found a home in heart health, it sounds like. That's what you're most passionate about.
Yes, absolutely. There is a lot of information we get taught about heart health. Where I'm sure a lot of your listeners know the feeling of going to the doctor and getting that list of what
Mm-hmm.
the limit or that, basic diet plan. And there's a lot more to heart health than we really expect. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
excited to dive in and talk about that and how that relates to kidney stones today, too.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. And I can totally relate with just being a foodie. Like, I feel like I would say, of my dietitian friends through every chapter of my career. So I've met a lot of dietitians in my life. We just love food, right? Like, we just love food and we want people to enjoy eating and in a way that is helpful to their bodies, essentially. Like, I feel like that's probably the biggest difference between at least what I've seen between a dietitian and maybe like Joe Schmo who's yelling about ingredients in the grocery store that you find on Instagram. Like a dietitian is like wants you to enjoy eating and wants you to probably eat more foods than you are eating right now, I imagine. Which is just, I feel like such a refreshing take on nutrition in our current diet culture, we'll call it.
Absolutely. I feel like a handful of my clients come to me feeling ashamed that they would refer to themselves as foodies. And I'm like, it's
Yeah.
totally
No, that's
okay to be a foodie and also like incorporate healthy foods that fit in your diet as well.
right.
It can go
It's
both.
not separate. In fact, it can very well go hand in hand because if you're a foodie, in theory, I would say by definition, you're interested in trying new things and new foods and ways of cooking and right? Like I agree. There's almost a shame around food and like saying that you enjoy food, and that's ridiculous. Like food is meant to be enjoyed. It's one of the pleasures of life, and that's a beautiful thing.
Exactly. It's almost like an advantage. And by like being a foodie, you're probably less stressed about like making healthy food
Hmm.
choices. And don't forget that, and we'll touch on it later, that stress can also contribute
Yes.
to kidney stones and blood pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. I just love that. So I wanted to highlight that before we went on to the next
Oh,
question.
yeah.
All right. So, what is the current research between the connect what on the connection between kidney stones and heart disease, and what can we kind of take from this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we know that kidney stones can lead to inflammation and oxidative stress. And this can be also found in the development of cardiovascular diseases of all fronts, right? So, some larger cohort studies have found that individuals with a history of kidney stones may have a higher risk of cardiovascular events.
Hmm.
The degree of risk varies, but there is some association. But it is important to note that while there is a connection between kidney stones and cardiovascular disease, and it's more recognized now, we do need additional research to really understand the implications fully and to inform our clinical practice regarding prevention and management.
Yeah, I agree. I think basically we know there's a connection between, if you have heart disease, you're more likely to have stones and vice versa. So to me, that basically says that if you have kidney stones, then you must be thinking about your heart health, essentially. That's what I take from that. And as we'll learn later, there's a whole lot of overlap. I think oftentimes at first glance, people think, oh my gosh, like these two diets, right? What my cardiologist wants me to be eating, or what my PCP wants me to be eating for high cholesterol, is exactly the opposite for stones, and really it's kind of the same thing, but we'll get to that eventually.
Oh,
um,
yeah.
so what are some of the possible risk factors that put people with kidney stones at higher risk of heart disease?
Yeah. So inflammation, as I mentioned before, a kidney stone can trigger a inflammatory response in the body, and chronic inflammation helps or unfortunately contributes to the development of certain cardiovascular diseases. Secondly, calcium and mineral imbalances. So calcium oxalate stones may indicate issues with metabolizing calcium, which can also in turn affect heart health.
Hmm.
Now, certain diets, and this is very similar in kidney stones, like high sodium or high diet with animal proteins, can raise cardiovascular risk. And we'll talk a little bit more about that depending on the type, and there's a lot more that goes into that. And finally, being insufficient fluid intake or dehydration, right? So if you're not drinking enough fluids throughout the day, this may directly contribute to kidney stones and can also increase blood viscosity and cardiovascular strain.
Hmm. Yeah, when you think about it, there's really a lot of similarities. Some of the same diet stuff puts you at risk of heart disease as well as kidney stones, which we'll definitely talk about later. And that inflammation is a really interesting one. There's some very new data that is looking at kidney stones being caused by that sort of chronic low level inflammation that we think about in diabetes or heart disease, and sort of these other more recognized, if you will, like chronic diseases. So I think that sort of chronic low level inflammation definitely makes sense, and probably a big reason why we see a lower risk of stones in diets that include more, quote, anti-inflammatory foods, aka more fruits and vegetables. So I think that's definitely probably a big thing that's going on with that causal link that we're seeing, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. And something that's, not entirely food related, but worth mentioning is chances are you're stressed about your kidney stones, right? And having more stress on the body could potentially be contributing to that kidney stone formation and also in turn be difficult for your heart to handle. And I just figured I would mention
Higher
that.
blood pressure, blah, blah, blah.
That's
Yep.
right. Yep,
Hmm.
and I'm sure that will come up later as well during our
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah. I literally just recorded a reel yesterday about a study that came out in November of 2024, they found that anxiety was a causal risk factor for kidney stones, and the magnitude of having anxiety and the increased risk of stones were somewhere between 3 to 6 times. So like that mind body connection is like cannot be understated. And I feel like when we think about doing healthy things for ourselves, so often we think about food and like exercise and like sure, like those things are incredibly important, but I think that mental health side of things very much for both the kidney stone and heart disease standpoint, like reducing stress and anxiety to help reduce blood pressure, et cetera, like cannot be uh like we need to talk about that more. That's what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
also making sure that we incorporate like nutrition related behaviors and foods that don't stress us out, right?
Yes.
Like I
Ditto
know we
to
talked about
that.
like being foodies earlier, like, and not feeling so overwhelmed and stressed by nutrition related changes. So I'm sure we'll get into that much more and how to find the best plan or starting point on the
Yeah,
roadmap per
for sure.
se.
For sure.
Mhm.
All right, so we touched on this before, but let's dive into this point a little bit more about how, at first glance, people often feel that a heart healthy diet is exactly the opposite of what a kidney stone friendly diet is, whatever that means for the rest. There's literally no one kidney stone diet. It has to be individualized to you and your urine risk factors. But I feel like, at first glance, when people first start Googling or they just dive into it based on some handout that their doctor gave them, they feel that they're totally the opposite. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh yeah, definitely. So before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about the low oxalate diet and how it's very restrictive, but that's the most common diet recommended for kidney stones, right?
Hmm.
Um, Now the only way to really truly know as far as what foods we need to limit in a diet is by that 24-hour urine collection. This way we know if or if any foods are really contributing to your stones as
Sometimes it's not diet related. Yeah. Hmm.
exactly, as opposed to like eliminating foods unnecessarily. So maybe thinking about other diet practices that you can do, right? So incorporating a variety of fruits and vegetables in your diet, whether high or low oxalate or not, limiting those
Get more
added
fruits and
sugars.
vegetables. Just eat more fruits and vegetables. I don't care. We're not eating enough as a society.
Exactly. Get that color, right?
Yeah.
Get the
Yes.
rainbow, taste the rainbow.
Yeah. Cheesy, but so true.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And like, focusing on whether or not certain foods in your household have added sugars and sodium that are contributing to your diet, as well as that moderate consumption of animal protein varieties, which we'll get
Mhm.
into later. So, as I said before, like all types of fruits and vegetables will still fit in a diet for kidney stones as well as cardiovascular risk. If not, it's probably benefiting you more in that all those fruits and vegetable varieties have things like antioxidants to help with inflammation, polyphenols, fiber, right? And that's my favorite starting point with heart health is fiber. So you'll probably hear me talk about that more in a
Hmm.
bit.
Yeah.
Now, as far as general recommendations, it's advised to consume about 5 servings of fruits and vegetable daily, right? So thinking in terms of a cup size or like a fistful, if that helps you get a visual of how much you
What a
should be
serving is.
eating
Hmm.
for. Yeah, so like some great ideas that could be really helpful to implement will be all types of berries, your strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, right? Or maybe some vegetable varieties like baby carrots, green peas, broccoli, cauliflower. And also, I want to reinforce this is not like a set in stone thing, no pun intended, but making sure that you think about what fruits and veggies you really love and
Hmm.
getting them in there as often as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, unfortunately, as you touched on, all people talk about for stones is oxalate. But if you followed me for more than 3 minutes, you know that I do not recommend a low oxalate diet. There's no data to show that it prevents stones. In fact, chances are, once we really dive into your urine test, we can figure out other things that's going on. And more than likely, it's excess animal protein, it's excess sugar, it's excess salt, it's not eating enough fruits and vegetables, which are all the exact same things that Patricia's going to walk us through to help improve heart health as well, or same principles essentially. So I feel like it's all it's all oxalate's fault. Like that's why it feels like it's so contradictory. But once you realize like that's really not that important. In fact, I would argue harming you because it's making it harder to eat fruits and vegetables. All of it's going to fall into place like so much easier. I promise. Yeah. So what are some foods that are worth adding to your diet to reduce the risk of heart disease? We maybe I sometimes hesitate to share these stats like, oh, and having stones increases your risk of heart disease because I feel like sometimes that does add anxiety to people. But again, it doesn't mean that you're going to have heart disease, but it just shows that making diet and lifestyle changes is really important. So what are some sort of simple things and foods that we can think about adding to our diets to help reduce that risk?
Yeah, definitely. So before we touched a little bit on produce with our fruit and vegetable varieties, I shared before that fiber is a big component when it comes to minimizing CVD risk. So other foods that have fiber are our beans, legumes, nuts, and seeds, right? So kind of breaking it down more specifically, I know nuts are commonly kind of barred on
Demonized.
that chocolate diet, right? But like if you wanted to keep it as simple with a nutrition related goal, adding in an ounce of nuts, whether it be almonds, pistachios, walnuts, cashews, I don't think you could really go wrong with any
No.
variety.
Pecans are my personal favorite, but literally
Okay.
any of them will work.
Yes. And sometimes people just love to add like nut butters in,
Mhm.
right? Sometimes it's just as easy to incorporate that. Now before you had mentioned like animal proteins being a big concern, maybe having too much of it, right? You could add in some plant-based proteins. A
Mhm.
super popular thing, or well, I would say like something that is rising in popularity is those blended burgers where people are doing like black bean burgers. So doing like a combination of like animal protein and
How have
plant-based.
I missed this? I did not know this was a thing.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
genius.
And like I'm sure your listeners are somewhat familiar with like Beyond Meat, where
Mhm.
like the protein or pea protein is primarily used. Like different I've seen like even walnuts used as breadcrumbs. There is just so many little adjustments you can make to recipes, or even just keeping it simple as adding in snacks if you don't love to cook, to minimize your CVD or
Mhm.
cardiovascular risk per
Yeah.
se.
Yeah, I love that point. Like, I feel like so often people feel that in order to really improve your health, you have to make these like massive overhaul changes, and that just simply isn't true. And also, I think could backfire, right? Like, if you're trying to change everything all at once, like, sure, you can do it for a week, but like, is that really going to stick? We know very clearly that doesn't it doesn't work. So instead of, maybe you love hamburgers. Like that's a good example because I love hamburgers. Like that is one thing that I crave pretty regularly is a hamburger and fries. So you can still totally have your hamburger, and maybe if you choose to get in your fiber that way, you can mix in some beans. I'm totally going to try that, by the way. I cannot believe I didn't know that was a thing. Um, but yeah, like like you can still have those foods, but maybe just adding some of these great sources of fiber can really, really make a difference, help get your cholesterol down and help reduce your overall heart disease risk.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I forgot to mention before is adding in potassium, because
Mm-hmm.
one thing is that you might be prescribed a diuretic to reduce your urine calcium secretion.
Hmm.
So you might be lacking in potassium, which actually controls heart rhythm and prevents the hardening of the arteries
Hmm.
that may increase your risk of high blood pressure, stroke, right?
Yeah.
So kind of going back to those high, fruits and vegetables that are high in potassium, whether it be foods like avocado,
Hmm.
bananas, oranges, right?
Tomatoes. Hmm.
Those are always great things to focus on too. And don't forget our high potassium beans too.
Yeah, absolutely. And nuts and seeds and tofu, like all of those, really any plant-based food, right? Whether it's whole grains like brown rice, pasta, whole grain bread, literally any fruit or vegetable, literally any whole food plant protein could essentially be classified as a higher potassium food. So that's a really, really good point because I think that's something that isn't talked about enough, just sort of like from a general health standpoint. I just did a presentation at the American Society of Nephrology on potassium, so I know the number off the top of my head. Literally 3% of people in America are getting enough potassium. 4,700 milligrams per day is what we should be getting, most of us. 3%. 3%. And the average intake is about half of that recommended 4,700 milligrams. And getting in enough potassium is from food. Supplements, for whatever reason, don't seem to do the same thing. But from food is associated with a lower risk of heart disease, hypertension, and kidney stones because potassium metabolizes to alkali. And I'm not going to go down down that route, but that potassium from plant foods is so, so, so important for both heart health and kidney stones. So thank you for bringing up that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So on the flip side, I know we said we're all about foods and adding things, and I feel like that is definitely the best way to go about it. But obviously, there are certain things that maybe we should just keep an eye on and make sure that we're not eating a ton of. So what are some foods that we might need to limit for people who are with stones who also are trying to reduce their risk of heart disease?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big advocate for thinking about what we can add, right? But we do have the science to support that there might be things that are helpful to limit in our diet, right? So, similarly to stone prevention, limiting sodium intake is the most common strategy. So, on the contrary, when we're not getting enough potassium, we are, many of us, getting too much sodium or salt, right?
Hmm.
So, one easy way to understand our sodium intake better is by using the nutrition facts label. And, I always encourage to like my clients to have a general understanding. I don't advise it to be like your end all be all situation, but, trying to prioritize those foods labeled, whether it be low sodium, reduced sodium, or sodium free when you're
Hmm.
going shopping, right? Some foods that we commonly know that are high in sodium are processed meats, like our deli meats, bacon, sausages,
Even
because
turkey. Turkey is high in sodium, lower in
yeah,
fat potentially, but high in sodium. Yes.
yeah, definitely. So, sodium's often added in the processing and preservation. So, if we can limit these in our diet in any way, that's wonderful. And maybe swap out for some potassium items can be
Yeah.
great. The one that people find most surprising is certain sauces and dressings.
Hmm.
So, one thing might be to measure out the serving size prior to eating your meals, right? To get a better understanding of how much salt you're adding into your daily intake through those
Hmm.
products. Now, these food items are a little bit more common, like our salty snacks, like our chips, our pretzels. So maybe kind of looking for that nutrition facts label there and finding those low sodium alternatives or like plant-based varieties. I know that now some people are opting for like pea snacks as one
Oh yeah, I
example.
love those. The pea, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
harvest snaps
Harvest
are
snaps. That's the name. Yes.
absolutely
Yep.
they're often lower in sodium
Mhm.
depending on the flavors, 'cause sometimes certain flavors are a little higher as opposed to others. And finally, like some of our classic American dishes, like our pizzas and our lasagnas, they're so good. But of course, you're adding a lot of layers of cheese and you're adding sauce, and like some people are using pre-made dough, and that is perfectly okay. Like I'm a big advocate for convenience as well, but seeing maybe if you can compare different low sodium cheese varieties or focusing on like low sodium sauces can be small shifts to reduce your overall daily intake.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the key message that I'm hearing from you is that it's choosing lower sodium foods that really is key to getting your salt down. I think if I had a dollar for every time someone said, "Oh, I don't add salt to my food, so I don't eat salt," I would never have to work again a day in my life because that is what everyone thinks. But really, around 80% of the salt, 75-ish% of the salt that we eat is already in our food, right? And so we can add salt actually, and also I think the goal is not a no salt diet. I think that's the other thing that trips people up a lot, right? Is they're like, oh my God, I can't eat anything because this has 100 milligrams of sodium in it. And like, no, like eating zero salt is also not good for you. It's avoiding that really high amount. And so it's kind of learning how to balance it. and and limiting those foods that already have a ton of salt in them. And honestly, if you're cooking a lot of your food at home from fresh, minimally processed ingredients, there's totally room to add some salt to your food. So it really kind of, you got to kind of look at the big picture when it comes to sodium, you know?
Absolutely. And another thing worth mentioning, and we've touched on this a couple of times through the episode, is that, moderate consumption of the animal-based proteins
Hmm.
or, prioritizing those plant-based proteins. So this has been found to be useful for stone prevention and cardiovascular risk.
Yes.
Too much animal protein can increase your risk of stones because you might be increasing the urine calcium. So, as we talked about before, like our tofu, beans, peas, and lentils, some easy ways are, like I mentioned, like those blended burgers earlier, but you can
Hmm.
also add like your beans into breakfast. Like traditional Spanish dishes have refried beans on the side, right? Or like grain bowls and burritos, or
Love a
maybe,
good bowl. That's my
oh,
favorite.
yes. Yeah. And like even with peas, like that can be, if you do frozen peas, those can be added to soups, pasta dishes. They can be added into fried rice. So there's so many opportunities that we don't often think about firsthand that can get those plant-based proteins on the
Yeah.
plate.
Yeah. What is your personal favorite sort of plant-based meal that's
Oh
sort of
my
your
God.
go-to? Well, those are two, okay, two questions. What's your favorite one and what's your go-to one that you make all the time? Because they might be different.
Good question. I would say favorite one is probably like a fried rice where I do
Mm-hmm.
edamame and then I
Mm-hmm.
throw like all my veggies, like my mushrooms, eggs in it, and I'll use like a this is kind of going with cardiovascular too, is like using polyunsaturated fats. So I throw
Yep.
in the sesame oil.
Mm-hmm.
Super easy. It's everything that I like, leftovers that you have on hand. So kind of a go-to, but also a personal favorite. But I would say my favorite go-to plant-based protein has to be tofu because, believe it or not, there are a lot of things you can do with tofu once you figure out the right way to cook it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So oftentimes I'll make like tofu nuggets, or like my go-to is like a tofu scramble,
Mm-hmm.
or even like recently I've been doing a lot of shredded tofu, and that's been
Oh.
coming out great as well.
What do you do with shredded tofu?
So if I do it, make it for both the fried rice, but I
Mhm.
actually did a sandwich or like a slider at one point, and it was like a
Oh.
barbecue flavor, and it came out great.
Yeah, like
It
a
was
shredded pork situation, but tofu. Yeah.
exactly kind of tying into that what we talked about, like blended ideas or like kind of
Hmm.
mixing those, recipes, like classic recipes we would normally make, having those alternatives.
Yeah. Yeah. That's funny. I don't do this so much anymore, but in my single days before I had a husband and twins, um, when my like lazy Tuesday night meal was to take ramen actually, and I would only use a portion of the powder to keep the sodium down, like the powder that comes with the ramen. And then I would add a whole bunch of vegetables. Like I would add spinach and tomatoes and usually mix an egg in there and frozen edamame. So I feel like that was my go-to dinner. Now I have to like cook a little bit more now that I have, people that I have to take care of. But I did that a lot when I was single.
That's so funny because I literally made a similar dish the other day. Like I buy instead of adding in the packets, I'll use like low sodium chicken broth. So this
Hmm.
something helpful for your listeners is by using low sodium chicken broth and
Hmm.
just throwing in all those veggies you've got on hand. Some that are really easy to do are like bok choy,
Hmm.
spinach, like mushrooms I mentioned
Yeah,
before,
frozen
shredded carrot.
peas. Yeah,
Yeah.
literally. It's a great way to use up all those little bits of vegetables that are like hanging out in the bottom of your vegetable drawer.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so cozy, especially during the winter months, because this
Hmm.
episode's going to still be out during like cold season, no
Yeah.
matter where you are. So it can be like both super nutritious and balanced, but also like comforting and enjoyable too.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned in your fried rice recipe, you mentioned eggs, which I'm sure brings up a very controversial topic when it comes to heart health. So, do you want to? I have to ask, just touch on how you feel about eggs for heart health.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up. Because we've heard that eggs are not great, especially in the presence of high cholesterol, right? But funny enough, something I've been talking about with my clients lately is that recent research shows that a safe amount of eggs that can be added into the diet would be 3 eggs a week, right? And also keeping in mind that bigger picture, like what else are you adding to it? And like eggs are a affordable protein source
Easy.
are packed
Hmm.
with other nutritious like components like vitamin D, lean protein and actually funny enough do have those healthy fat sources like mono and polyunsaturated fats. So, I've been kind of advising like as a way to keep it convenient, affordable, and, nutritious to keep using those eggs. That is absolutely okay, and but also just being mindful to how you're preparing them at home as well as what kind of balance you have around that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think eggs can be a wonderful option because of the way that it can get you to eat other foods. So, like, certainly if we're having eggs, bacon, and toast, like, totally fine to have, obviously, if that's what you love. Like, we can make that work. But eggs can be a great way to get vegetables in, especially at breakfast when you may not be eating vegetables otherwise, right? So, having a ton of mushrooms and peppers and onions with an egg and a piece of whole grain toast, like, that is a very different meal than eggs, bacon, and sausage and hash browns, right? So I feel like eggs can be a great way to get in a lot of other nutritious foods just by how you might prepare them. Does that make sense?
Yes, that is spot on.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, awesome. All right, I'm glad that we touched on eggs because that wasn't even on our list. I can't believe we didn't think about talking about eggs. So I'm glad that came up.
Yeah,
All
totally.
right, any other foods that we want to be maybe mindful of that we're not eating too much of, or did we touch on everything?
I think we talked a little bit about our animal proteins and our sodium. One that is brought up, but I touched on a little bit earlier is also like added sugars, right? So we
Hmm.
all know the implications of having too much added sugar in our diet. So, one way that, is worth mentioning is that nutrition facts label, kind of taking a look briefly at, okay, are there any added sugars? So one way to understand that is maybe raw sugar, molasses, or like a syrup or something might be added as one of the first ingredients on the label, right?
Hmm.
So maybe that's something you might want to try to limit or focus on portioning out the serving so you're mindful to the intake. And most, of course, we know about like our sugar sweetened beverages, and I'm going to touch on this probably in a little bit, like our lemonades, our sodas, our juices, that have sugar added to them. Trying to keep mindful of that and limit them in the diet because they definitely can raise the risk for cardiovascular disease and high blood
And
pressure.
kidney stone.
That's right.
Yep, those are the only beverages that increase the risk of stones are sugary drinks, and Diet Cola, specifically Diet Cola. But literally every other beverage on this earth, including tea, is associated with a lower risk of stones. But definitely there's something about those sugary beverages, Kool-Aid, lemonade, punch, sugary coffee drinks, regular soda, right? Like there's definitely something going on that is increasing stone risk, and we know very, very clearly that it increases the risk of heart disease as well.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So, what are some cooking tips that you would recommend for people that want to reduce the risk of heart disease?
Yeah. So, kind of touching on what we talked about before, like reviewing the nutrition facts label for sodium content. So, as we were talking about our favorite go-to recipes, I shared I was using low sodium cooking broth. Sometimes I'll even use like low sodium soy sauce as well to
Hmm.
add that umami I'm looking for, but just a small shift to minimize that sodium when I prepare meals. Now, again, to reiterate, low sodium is typically 140 milligrams or less per serving or focusing on those no sodium varieties. Another thing you could do is prioritize cooking sprays or those cooking oils high in poly and monounsaturated fats, like our avocado oil, our olive oil, peanut oil, sesame oil, or canola oil.
Mhm.
You can also just take a simple shift to cook in ways that require less sodium. So maybe that looks like our air fryer, right? That's become more popular over the last couple of
People
years.
love air fryers. I do not have one, but people are obsessed. If I had more
Yeah.
counter space, I would get one.
Yes, and it's really interesting now that they're selling ovens that have an air fryer feature. So
Hmm.
even if you're on the lookout for a new oven, that might be one thing to take advantage of is the ones with an air frying option.
Hmm.
You could also, opt to grill, bake, roast, or broil certain foods, especially protein foods, because I know we really love our fried seafood and our fried chicken, which, of course, we know like lean proteins are great in terms of a cardiovascular diet, but how we cook it can also be, detrimental to overall intake. Also, something worth mentioning is using reduced fat varieties to cut down on any unwanted saturated fat because saturated fat actually does raise cardiovascular risk. So when I refer to reduced fat, this might be like low fat milks, cheeses, and yogurt varieties.
Hmm.
Or if you're not crazy about that, because I know some people feel it alters the taste, why not try like a plant-based protein alternative? So kind of tying into and like what I talked about before with like our blended recipes, people are starting to use avocado as like a fat substitute in baking and
Or like
beans.
a mayonnaise substitute, I feel like on a sandwich or something to add that creaminess. And yeah.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that can even be like a great small thing to try out, in cooking and prep when you're home.
Yeah. Yeah, the milk point is a really important one because we talk a lot about getting in enough calcium for kidney stone prevention. And milk is a really, really wonderful way to get in that calcium. People who eat more dairy have a lower risk of stones in every single study I've ever seen, ever. And so I think one very obvious way to make that a little bit more heart healthy is just to choose a skim or fat-free or low-fat version of that. And if you'd like, I think there's definitely a place for the plant-based milk substitutes in a kidney stone friendly diet as well.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
Melanie, something worth sharing too is some people think they have to eliminate all dairy, kind of like when we talked about our eggs earlier and how
Hmm.
and there was some science saying that eggs were not great as part of a heart healthy diet. And now we're still kind of on the fence about dairy and what role that plays. But, something else that can be helpful is focusing on those low sodium cheese varieties too.
Hmm.
So specifically like your mozzarella, ricotta, and
Goat
cottage.
cheese, my personal favorite.
Yes, I love a good cheese variety. So
Hmm.
definitely don't feel like in order to reduce your risk of cardiovascular conditions or even kidney stones that you have to remove dairy. Clearly but on both sides it is so important.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think um, and correct me if I'm wrong, the last I knew, the research for because the problem people feel with both eggs and dairy is that they do have cholesterol in them, but the data is much stronger that how much saturated fat you consume, specifically from non-dairy animal products, so saturated fat from red meat and fatty chicken and these types of things, that increases your risk of higher cholesterol and heart disease a whole lot more than how much cholesterol you actually eat. And I feel like that's a really hard lesson for people to learn because it's like, oh, well, cholesterol isn't increasing my cholesterol, it's saturated fat, right? Like it's kind of a it's not super intuitive, but I really feel like it's that saturated fat that really tends to be a much bigger concern. Correct? That could have changed. It's been a while since I've been immersed in CVD literature, but last I knew that was the case.
Yeah, the most recent recommendations that I've seen on my end are to limit to, again, don't want to get too caught up in the numbers, but 10% or less of your calories should be coming from saturated fat,
Hmm.
right? But I always say if it's more helpful and you're not trying to get caught up in tracking and all of that,
Yeah.
The best way to understand is just to, limit those foods and, try to figure out which ways you can substitute out with those poly and monounsaturated fats where
Hmm.
possible, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah. And that's why I think thinking about going back to one of our very first points that we made about trying to think about all of this, whether it's stones or heart health, about adding things that are health promoting. You only eat so much food throughout the day, right? Like your little tummy can only handle so much food. And so if you are focusing on incorporating some of these other heart healthy fats and the fiber foods and fruits and vegetables and plant proteins, like just by nature of doing that, like you're gonna likely be eating less of some of the other things. You're just kind of prioritizing those other things. We're not taking away bacon. We're not taking away butter. But if you're having bacon with, a nice egg scramble with a ton of vegetables, you're probably going to eat less bacon, right? So it kind of all works together. Next question. What are your thoughts on eating out when it comes to heart health? Because I think that is something that people struggle with a lot. People feel that they can't eat out, and that is definitely not true, I imagine. But there's maybe some tips that you could share to make it a bit more of a heart healthy and kidney stone friendly meal.
Yes, sure. So like it is totally possible to still eat out by on a kidney stone prevention diet and a heart healthy diet. So as we've discussed throughout this episode, where possible, if you could prioritize those plant-based proteins like tofu, tempeh, beans, nuts, and seeds where possible.
Hmm.
So I'm often encouraging my clients to order beans on the side when they go to a Spanish restaurant, or maybe opting for tofu if you go for hibachi, if that's available to you, right? One of the things that's become more popular is those chain restaurants like Chipotle, Sweetgreen, and Cava, because you can choose your toppings and control the types and portion sizes. So that can be like just a great sort of way without thinking about it to get
Hmm.
those foods on your plate, but also enjoy eating out as well. Now, going off of preparing meals at home, if you do decide to order animal proteins, that is okay. As we have emphasized, having a variety is so important, but try to prioritize those animal protein types low in saturated fats. So that might look like our grilled chicken, maybe like our turkey, and of course, trying to keep turkey in moderation with sodium as well, maybe like pork tenderloin or like a salmon or maybe tuna, something that's like very lean, right? And when I say moderate animal protein consumption, I do want to share this would look like a card deck size or 3 to 4 ounce portions, right? Also thinking about where you can add in those produce. We were big on produce at the beginning of the episode and we still are. So maybe like one great example is Chinese restaurants offer steamed vegetables like steamed broccoli or green beans. So
Hmm.
maybe having that on the side when you order takeout,
Hmm.
or at brunch, getting that fresh fruit cup as like a way to help with your produce intake and have a small shift. Now, I do like to share a couple of general strategies, whether that be like as far as sharing portions with loved ones, bringing portions of the meal home, or reviewing the menu when you go, as just a way to help be mindful, to plan, and, continue towards any nutrition related goals you might have.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, awesome. That was a lot of information, Patricia. Thank you so much for going over like in the 40-minute episode or whatever this is, kind of like everything heart health related. Because as you shared at the beginning, there is a lot to it, right? It's a lot more than just like eating fewer eggs. In fact, that may or may not be important anyway. So a
Yeah,
lot of information.
we definitely skimmed the surface today, and like I am always available to answer any questions your viewers might have about heart health, or if they just have a concern about something they read online, I'm happy to debunk and answer wherever
Yeah,
possible.
awesome. Where can people find you if they do want to reach out?
Yeah, so I do have social media. I'm on Instagram and TikTok under the Dietitian Dish with a T. Or you can contact me through my website or email, my website being the dietitiandish with a T.com, or my email is dietitian.trish@gmail.com.
Awesome. And I will link to all of those platforms and websites and everything in the show notes so people can easily find you. Thank you again, Patricia, so much. I think this is a super helpful episode, and I hope really helps people kind of understand because I get questions almost daily, like, oh my gosh, like how in the world can I eat for heart and for kidney stones? Like, and truly, 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 99.99% of it is exactly the same. It really it doesn't have to be so hard. It really is just kind of like just eating more fruits and vegetables, eating some things in moderation, swapping in some more plant proteins. Like that's kind of what it comes down to for a lot of people. But not to oversimplify it, but
Yeah, agreed. And if
yeah,
there's anything like I can leave your viewers with, it's that thinking about what you can add. Always thinking about areas you can add and especially small nutrition related changes for the long term and
yeah,
sustainable
yeah,
outcomes.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you again so much for your time and for sharing all of your knowledge. And thank you to all of you, as always, for listening to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. And I hope to see you next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.